When we talk about the life of a man who was named states' rights Gist from birth, we're talking about a man whose entire education, his entire identity was wrapped up in deep Southern culture. A man with a name like that will have the politics of his father deeply ingrained in every cell of his being. And we remember Gist as an ardent secessionist, states' rights advocate. And in this, our third of 6 videos about the 6 Confederate generals who were killed here at the Battle of Franklin, I hope to tell a little bit more about his life, where he came from, why he believed the way he believed, and then of course cover the final moments he had on this earth as he died on the ground on which I currently stand. Now, Gist was born just northwest of here on September 3rd, 1831. He was the 9th child of the very wealthy and very politically connected Nathaniel and Elizabeth Gist. Gist received his education here in Columbia at the South Carolina College, which is known today as the University of South Carolina. After that, he attended law school for 1 year at Harvard before coming back to South Carolina, passing the bar exam, and establishing his own law practice here in town. While working as a lawyer, he joined the South Carolina State Militia, where he was eventually promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. With no formal military education or background, Gist became an officer the same way that many people did back then, through politics, education, and family power. Gist maintained his position with the South Carolina Militia through the Battle of Fort Sumter until the Confederate Army was more formally organized, at which point he was officially commissioned as an officer in the Confederate States Army. Gist was present at the Battle of Secessionville, and then he would see service in Virginia at the Battle of Manassas, where he would assume brigade command for the very first time. After that, he saw some combat in Mississippi before eventually being transferred to the Army of Tennessee. Once there, he and his brigade would fight with distinction at the battles of Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and all through the Atlanta campaign, where Gist would be wounded in the hand. And once Atlanta fell, Gist would march north for the very last time with the Army of Tennessee until they met their eventual destruction at the Battle of Franklin. Now, if you go to Winstead Hill on the battlefield at Franklin, you'll see where all of the generals who were killed there each have their own monument. Now, whoever wrote the inscription on Gist's monument clearly aired out his frustration over Gist's lack of promotion in the very first sentence when he wrote, and I quote, "The tragedy at Franklin quite possibly may have been averted had this scholarly South Carolina blue blood been given the promotion to division command that his service record warranted." Now, is that likely? I'd say probably not. But it remains there etched in stone to reflect the beliefs of many that think that Gist was unfairly slighted for higher command. I'm standing on top of Winstead Hill, where General Hood would have formed and issued his orders to attack the Federal works in Franklin. The view is obstructed by trees today, but on November 30th, 1864, if you were looking directly behind me down at the bottom of this hill, you would have seen the men of Brown's division forming up in lines of column getting ready to attack, Gist's brigade being among them. Using this map up on top of Winstead Hill, you can see where we are right here, and it depicts the 4 brigades of Brown's division right here. And you can see that Gist is in the front and the far left of the division, which would have put him just right there beyond these trees at the bottom of the hill. The fact that these men are advancing in lines of column is very important in understanding the next phase of the battle. From right here, they advance this direction. Everything behind me is what was the vast open plains of Franklin south of town, and this all is where the battle took place. Now, typical attack formations that we're used to seeing in the Civil War is men lined up shoulder to shoulder with the man to his left and his right, all guns facing the enemy, pushing forward. But the main Federal defenses in Franklin are almost 2 miles that direction. And that is a long, long distance to be dressing to your left and right, marching forward towards the enemy. So like I said earlier, they formed into lines of column. Again, to the map, you can see that this is the Federal line of works in town. And as they approach, they're approaching long ways, perpendicular to that line. So each of these columns only has a couple of men leading in the front. Everyone else is marching behind them, following nose to back. That means you've only got a couple of guns facing front towards the enemy. Everyone else, they only can fire to the left and right, which is obviously a bad thing in this case. So columns are terrible formations for making attacks, but columns offered one distinct advantage that the Confederates desperately needed here, and that was speed. Once the attack began, they would have roughly 1.5 miles until they made first contact with Wagner's advance line, and then 2 miles to the main line of defenses. The attack plan hinged on their ability to overrun Wagner's line before they get a chance to retreat, and they would need the speed of columns in order to make that happen. All right, so pulling out of Winstead Hill and onto Columbia Pike. To my left, the men of Brown's division would have been advancing in the same direction that I'm driving, and to the right of the road would have been the men of Claiborne's division. All through this area, they were pushing forward in lines of column as fast as they could, trying to get where Wagner's advance line was. And somewhere right around here, these men would halt and they would transition into their regular attack formations that we all know. Because just right here past the Shell station is where Wagner's men were positioned on the advance line. People often talk about units during the Civil War as either being well drilled and well trained, or poorly drilled and poorly trained. But what does that mean exactly? Well, moving in these mass formations takes a lot of practice. And the Army of Tennessee was well trained and well drilled. And one of the things that they knew how to do very well was to rapidly deploy in lines of battle from column. So if I'm a US soldier on this advanced line, I am facing that direction, and I am watching the entire Confederate Army deploy from lines of column into lines of battle directly in my face just a couple of hundred yards away. This was a terrifying sight. 20,000 men directly to your front, and only about 3,000 of you on this advance line, and you were being told to hold. It did not take long for these Federal troops to crumble, and to my left over here, you would have seen Gist and his brigade completely bulldoze the Federal right that belonged to Lane's brigade. One of the officers in Gist's brigade said, "He rode across our front, and upon returning, ordered the charge in concert with General Gordon." It was at that moment that Gist rode directly in front of the 24th South Carolina. They said that he waved his hat and disappeared into the smoke of battle. Lane's men retreated as fast as they could, but Gordon and Gist were hot on their heels, and before they knew it, they were both within 100 yards of the Federal works. But unlike Gordon's brigade, who was plowing through the main line to his right, Gist would lead his men straight into a thick locust grove. Directly behind me was that locust grove, and as Gist rode his horse into the thick of it, it was shot out from underneath him, and he was forced to dismount. He continued leading his men in the attack on foot through this area right here, but the locust grove was a major obstruction, and they had placed abattis or abattis, which were man-made obstructions designed to slow attacking soldiers. But of course, if Gist is going to have to hit this locust grove, so are the retreating men of Lane's brigade. And before you know it, both Federal and Confederate troops are all tangled up in this area with one another. So put yourself in the shoes of a Federal rifleman on the main line of defense right here. When you look out, you see your own soldiers tangled up in the locust grove with Confederates, and you try to find a target. Do you pull the trigger? Do you risk shooting your own man to shoot the Confederate behind him? Well, what we do know is that in this area, the Federal troops on the main line did slacken their fire. This allowed Lane's men to get into the works, but it also allowed Gist's men to get into the works. He pushed his men in the attack past the locust grove and up this hill straight to the works. Right where my hand is, right on the crest of this hill, is where the Federal trenches are. But it's right here, near this spot, between the locust grove and the main Federal works behind me, that States' Rights Gist would meet his end. A single minie ball ripped through his chest. He stumbled backwards and collapsed. His aide, Lieutenant Trenholm, almost immediately began evacuating Gist from the field. Trenholm said that as he was carrying him away, Gist uttered his final wish. He said that he wanted to be taken home to his wife. His men continued fighting through here and made great gains in the area, but like the rest of the Confederate Army, they were repulsed. His brigade suffered unbelievable casualties in this area. The 16th South Carolina alone had over 100 casualties, and 3/4 of those casualties were killed, which normally the number of wounded far exceeds the number of killed. That just goes to show how absolutely brutal and desperate the fighting in this area really was. The division hospital for Brown's division was the Harrison House, which sits just past Winstead Hill south of here. So the Harrison House is almost certainly where he was taken, though it was never exactly said. Now Gist had a body servant. He went by the name Uncle Wiley Howard. Howard was enslaved by Gist and accompanied him in the army to act as a servant. Now waiting in the rear during the battle, Howard got word that Gist had been shot and was most likely dead. Howard walked around in the dark until he found the field hospital where Gist was located. He talked to a man named Dr. Wright. Dr. Wright told Howard that Gist had suffered terribly when he first got to the hospital, but eventually the pain subsided. He repeated his request to be taken home to his wife, and he died at about 8:30 p.m. For a long time, it was believed that Gist was laid out on the back porch at Carnton like several other generals. But now we know, of course, that that is simply not true. Only 2 of the generals killed at Franklin still lie in their original graves. In the years after the war, the other 4 would be disinterred and reburied near their original homes. Of those that had their body moved, Gist was the first to return home. In the spring of 1866, his family went to Franklin to retrieve him from his original grave, and they moved him back home to Columbia, South Carolina, and buried him right here in the churchyard at the Trinity Episcopal Cathedral. Now I think it's a good time to address a common question we get, which is, was States' Rights Gist his actual name? And if you look at the headstone right next to me, you will see that was his actual name. Now, with states' rights often being cited as a cause of the Civil War, I've been asked before, did States' Rights change his name to reflect his commitment to the cause? And the answer to that question is no. He was actually born with this name. So, how did Gist get his name? Well, he was born in 1831 during a time of serious unrest in South Carolina known as the Nullification Crisis. Now, during the Nullification Crisis, South Carolina said that they had the right to nullify and make unenforceable any law set forth by the federal government that they as a state found to be unconstitutional. Specifically, during the crisis, South Carolina was protesting 2 federal tariffs, which the federal government was fully prepared to enforce by military action, and South Carolina was fully prepared to fight against by the same. Fortunately, a peace was negotiated before any serious violence occurred, But this event, which centered around the issue of states' rights, gave the general's father the opportunity to name his son after a political belief that he held near and dear to his heart. Directly behind me and right in front of the South Carolina State House stands a statue that is dedicated to all the South Carolina soldiers who died during the Civil War. And though it's mostly obscured by this beautiful Christmas tree, I can still read this very important inscription. It reads, "This monument perpetuates the memory of those who, true to the instincts of their birth, faithful to the teachings of their fathers, and constant in the love for their state, died in the performance of their duties." Gist has gone down in history as a lawyer, a soldier, a general who bravely fought and died with his men on the battlefield. But he also goes down in history as an ardent supporter of slavery, a man who made no effort to hide and had no reason to hide the fact that he believed that slavery was a moral good and not just a necessary evil. Now, I do not mention that to disparage Gist or detract from his legacy, but a video honoring Gist would not be complete without also honoring the fact that the issue of slavery is a vital and relevant part of his story. And speaking openly and honestly about this brings honor to Gist and the hundreds of thousands of Americans who had to fight and die to figure out what kind of country we were going to be moving forward. Were we going to be a nation that truly believed that all men are created equal? And that is vital to understanding why the Civil War is so important and why men like Gist are so important. You and I were born into a world where everyone around us understood and taught us that owning another human being was morally wrong. Men like Gist, they were not born into that world. They were born into a world where everyone around them told them that owning humans was morally good and necessary. Now, I know we don't like to talk about having empathy and compassion for slaveholders. We have empathy and compassion for those who were enslaved. But I think it's important to understand that we can condemn their beliefs in slavery and we can condemn what they were doing as evil because we understand things through the historical lens of modern beliefs. The issue of whether or not slavery was right or wrong was far from settled in 1861, and our country would have to endure 4 years of brutal war to decide what our collective stance on the issue was going to be moving forward. As from every argument about law and morals from the founding of our country until today, there are winners and there are losers in those arguments as we figure out how to proceed forward as a country. And Gist was on the losing side of this war. But as we look back to the founding of our country until today, the winners and the losers of all of those arguments are still Americans. Thank you so much for watching this third installment of a 6-part video series that we are doing on the 6 Confederate generals who died at the Battle of Franklin. If you would like to check out the first and second videos on Otho Strahl and John Adams, they are on the YouTube channel. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you will follow the Battle of Franklin Trust on social media, YouTube, Instagram, all of the things. I also want to take this time to mention that battlefield reclamation in Franklin is making huge strides. We are acquiring properties that we never thought we'd be able to get a hold of, but they are extremely, extremely expensive. Please check our social media for a story about a $5 million property that we have secured under contract, but we have to raise the money by a certain time in order to purchase it. The purchase of this building has been a goal for an extremely long time and will completely change the way the battlefield looks and how we interpret it. We are so excited about it. Fundraising is in full gear for that. If you have never donated to support battlefield reclamation before, this is your chance to help save an extremely important piece of property that is vital to understanding and interpreting the Battle of Franklin. We have worked for so long to get this property, and we are gonna fight to make sure we have the money to get it. Please consider helping us and save the Battle of Franklin. Save the Battle of Franklin.